Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining me. I'm Miss Carol, and I'm so glad you joined me. I hope you're enjoying that a little bit of a snow break that we're having. It's very beautiful, isn't it? Let's go back and do a little review before we start our lesson today. If you remember, King David has died, but before he died, he made Solomon king after him, didn't he? And God blessed Solomon right away by asking him a question. He said, ask me for anything you want, anything at all, and I will give it to you. We talked about how amazing that would be, wouldn't it? For somebody for God, to say God can do anything, to say we can have anything we want. But what was it Solomon asked for? Wisdom. Because we said probably he was between 18 and 20 years old. He was very young, and he knew he was very young and inexperienced. And he knew he needed wisdom to be able to lead God's people, his great nation. And because he asked for wisdom, God gave him everything else, didn't he? He gave him wealth. He gave him lots of riches. He made it so he didn't have to fight any enemies as king like his father David had done. His enemies were quiet. It was amazing how God blessed him. But before King David died, he told Solomon, if you remember, he told him, now, I asked God if I could build him a temple because here I am in a beautiful palace, and God is still just in a tent, the tabernacle, right? And I want him to have a temple. And God said, you're not the one to build it for me, David, because you've been a great warrior, but you've shed too much blood. But your son Solomon is the one that I choose who will be able to build my temple for me. But he went ahead and he gave David the plans, the blueprints for exactly how he wanted the temple built and all of the materials he needed. And David spent years collecting all of the materials necessary for that temple because he knew Solomon was young and inexperienced and he was going to need a lot of help. So David did a lot of the prior planning for his son to make it easier for him. We know that the temple was going to be built in Jerusalem, the city of David, on Mount Moriah, a mountain in the middle of the city there in the city. And we first learn about Mount Moriah, believe it or not, in the book of Genesis, chapter 22. And let's just read that because this is most interesting. Sometime later, God tested Abraham. Now, this is back to Abraham. He said to Abraham, Abraham. And Abraham said, here I am. God said, take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the area of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on the mountain I will show you. So early the next morning, Abraham got up and loaded his donkey. He took with him 2 of his servants and his son Isaac. And when he had cut enough wood for the burnt offering, he set out for the place God had told him, Mount Moriah. On the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance, and he said to his servants, stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there. We will worship, and then we will come back to you. So Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and placed it on his son Isaac, and he himself carried the fire and the knife. As the 2 of them went on together, Isaac spoke up and said to his father Abraham, Father? Yes, my son, Abraham replied. The fire and wood are here, Isaac said, but where's the lamb for the burnt offering? Abraham answered, God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. And the 2 of them went on together. And when they reached the place God had told him about, Abraham built an altar there and arranged the wood on it. He bound his son Isaac with rope, and he laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then he reached out his hand and he took the knife to kill his son. But the angel of the Lord called out from heaven, "Abraham, Abraham." "Here I am," he replied. "Do not lay a hand on the boy. Do not do anything to him, because now I know that you love and fear God, because you have not kept from me your son, your only son." And Abraham looked up, and there in a thicket he saw a ram caught by its horns. And he went over and took the ram and sacrificed it as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called that place, "The Lord will provide." And to this day it is said, "On the mountain of the Lord it will be provided." So my goodness, we first learn about Mount Moriah from Abraham when he was getting ready to sacrifice Isaac, just as God had asked him to do. All right, I want to then show you a little bit more about Mount Moriah. At the end of David's reign, he got it into his head that he was going to number all of the fighting men in Israel. And God did not tell him to do this. In fact, it was kind of a message from Satan to trick David into doing the wrong thing. And David did do the wrong thing. And God said, "Because you've done this, I'm going to have to bring a plague. I'm going to have to do something." And he gave him some choices, and David said, "No, if I need to be punished, I want it to come from your hand." And so he said, "Then I will send a plague on Jerusalem." And David went to Mount Moriah there in Jerusalem, and he offered a sacrifice, built an altar to God, and asked him, "Please, don't keep this plague going. Don't kill any more people." So David goes to Mount Moriah, which happened to be the threshing floor. It was owned by a man named Araunah, who was a Jebusite, and it was his threshing floor, where they brought their wheat. And David goes there, and he says, "I need to buy this from you. I need this land from you. I need it." And so he bought the land from Araunah, and then he built his altar. And do you see up in the sky, the artist that drew this thought maybe that's what the angel of the Lord, the sword, looked like as he was going through Jerusalem, sending the plague on the people. But David built an altar there on Mount Moriah. And on this spot is where David said, "This needs to be where the temple of the Lord is built." And so that's what he decided, and that's what God wanted as well. So Mount Moriah goes way back, doesn't it? Abraham built an altar to sacrifice his only son there, and David builds an altar to save the people from any more punishment from what he had done. Now let's go back and think about the Tabernacle of God, because if you remember, God had told Moses, he wanted this tabernacle, this house of worship, built for him when Moses was on Mount Sinai. And he gave him the plans and told him exactly how he wanted it built, if you remember. And the tabernacle is just a tent. That's what it means, the tent. But that's where they worshiped. Do you remember all the things they had to make to go into that tabernacle? This was the altar where they sacrificed the animals, the priests did. This was the basin where they washed their hands and cleansed themselves. And then we come to the actual tabernacle, the actual tent itself. And so only the priest could go inside there. There were 2 rooms, if you remember, 2 rooms in the tabernacle. And the first room was called the holy place. And do you remember what was in the holy place? There was the lampstand that was to be kept burning at all times. There was the table of showbread, or the table of presence, that had the 12 unleavened loaves of bread, one for each tribe of Israel. And in front of the veil that separated the holy place from the most holy place, or the Holy of Holies, was the altar of incense, which burned before the Lord and went up to him as a pleasing aroma, like our prayers do. And then we have the most holy place where the Ark of the Covenant was kept. Inside that ark, do you remember, there were three things. There was the 10 Commandments, the 2 stones. There was the jar of manna, showing that God took care of them and fed them all during their wanderings in the wilderness, right? And then there was Aaron's rod that budded, that proved to the tribes of Israel that Aaron was the chosen one to be the high priest. And the high priest could only enter the Holy of Holies one day a year. Remember, only one day a year. One day a year. So that was where God was. That's where his presence could be seen, in that cloud and the fire at night. So all of these years later, that's still where they have to worship. It's just in that tent. And so, you know, David wants to change that, and God's in agreement with him, but not for him to do it. And we learn that, as I said, that God had given the plans to David, exactly how he wanted it built. Every detail of every item that needed to go into the temple. And they had this temple. What makes the temple different from the tabernacle is that it's going to be built of stone. It's not a tent. It's not going to be packed up and moved around. It is permanent. It's going to be in Jerusalem. It's a permanent place made with stones. And it's going to have different rooms on the outside of it for storerooms to keep the treasuries. It'll even be where they keep the old items, except for the ark. The other items, the lampstand, the table of presence, the altar of incense, all of those things probably were stored in those rooms around the temple as well. And it told exactly what the priests and the Levites were supposed to do, and all of the equipment that was used in the temple. The Lord had written all of these with his hand, David told Solomon. Be strong and courageous and do the work. You must not be afraid of this hard work, because the Lord will not leave you until the temple is completed. The priests and Levites will help you, and others will volunteer to provide any of their skills for any kind of work. And yes, even the leaders of Israel and the entire army are at your command. Hiram, king of Tyre, provided cedar trees from Lebanon for the temple, and we have workers all lined up and ready. And the workers for the temple alone, there were 80,000 stone cutters alone, just to cut the stones. And so let's read in 2 Chronicles chapter 3. Then Solomon began to build the temple of the Lord in Jerusalem on Mount Moriah, where the Lord had appeared to his father David. It was on the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite, the place provided by David. King Solomon began building on the 2nd day of the 2nd month in the 4th year of his reign. So he had been a king 4 years when he begins to build the temple. And we're going to then learn a little bit about this temple. The temple is going to face east. Do you remember that's the way the tabernacle was? It faced east to the sunrise. And that's the way the temple is to be built as well. It's going to be 90 feet long. All right, let me get the plans. This would be maybe a little bit of what it might have looked like, so you could see they would know how to build it. 90 feet long to right here. It had a portico or a porch right here as well as an entrance there. All right, so it was 90 feet long and 30 feet wide, and it was, in places, it was 45 feet high, and the Holy of Holies, or the most holy place, was built like a cube, 30 feet by 30 feet and 30 feet high as well. All right, so, and then these would have been the extra rooms on the outside of the temple where they could store things. All right, so let's take a look at the temple and let's just see what that would look like on the inside. All right, first let's look at the courtyard. We see in here that there is this, if you can tell, is the altar, much, much bigger than the altar that was in the tabernacle. The altar, in fact, was 30 feet by 30 feet, so it was square, 30 by 30 by 30, and 15 feet high, which is much higher than my ceilings in my house. And this is the new basin for washing, but it held 11,000 gallons of water, and it was used by the priest. And then we have other basins as well, 5 on the north and 5 on the south as well, if you can see those, that were also used for the ceremonial washing. And then we have the portico, which was that porch before you enter into the temple. And look at those pillars as you're coming in. Aren't they beautiful? And I believe those were bronze. Okay. Now let's go inside that temple and let's see what's in there that may be alike and different from the tabernacle. All right, so here we see that instead of one lampstand, there are actually 5 lampstands, if you can see them. Back here on this wall and here on this wall, 5 lampstands. There's the table of showbread. It is in there as well. I think it's right here with the same 12 loaves of bread representing the 12 tribes. And then we have the altar of incense that leads to, that absolutely is right by the veil that leads to the most holy place, or the Holy of Holies. In there is the original Ark of the Covenant, but now there's no manna, no jar of manna, and there's no rod that was Aaron's. We don't know what happened, but we do know that the 2 tablets were still in there of the 10 Commandments. And then there were 2 gold cherubim with their wings that covered over the ark. Once again, that could only be entered once a year by the high priest to offer atonement for the sins of the people. All right, now that would be something, wouldn't it? That's a beautiful, beautiful place. But let's also look at what all of that might have cost, because we find out that just the gold alone in there was amazing. There was 100 tons of gold that David had donated from his treasury, in his royal treasury. There was 170 tons of gold that the leaders of Israel donated, which meant 270 tons of gold used to build the temple. Today, that'd be worth about $15 billion. So the people were very generous, weren't they? And look at the walls. They were made of cedar. The walls here would be where you would enter. Here's the porch. And the walls were made of cedar that were overlaid with gold, but also carved in there were palm trees, if you can see them, and cherubim. And then, of course, there was the veil. And this would have been the Holy of Holies, where the ark was, and the cherubim and their wings covered over the Ark of the Covenant. Can you believe all of that gold? It must have been fabulous. And here you can see some of the storerooms and where they might have put things there and stored them in there. And remember the high priest garment. It's still the same as it always was for the high priest to go in and do and offer the sacrifices for the people. All right, so the temple was built. It took Solomon 7 years to build that temple with all the help that he had, especially all that his father had already done for him. So now God has a permanent dwelling place there, right? God's presence will be seen there. I have 2 take-homes for you. One of the temple, a dot to dot. And this is just something you can color that also shows the inside, so what somebody thinks it probably looked like. All right, so how are things going to continue to go with Solomon? He's certainly been blessed up until now. Do we think he's going to remain faithful and follow God's laws? Well, you need to come back next week, because let's find out what does happen with Solomon. All right, I love you. Be the best that you can be. I miss you. Bye-bye.